Hey guys, thanks for joining us today. Today I'm going to go over the 3 most common ways to get into fly fishing. Now what I mean by that is basically what kind of rig you're going to be running on your leader to try and catch fish with. Now there's a million different ways to do any single one of these rigs, but this is the most common kind of starting point for people to get into this. Now everybody has their own preferences, kind of like how do they like to tie their knots, how far the flies need to be, and what order the flies need to be in. But as I stated before, this is kind of just a starting point, a general guidelines to get you fishing. So perhaps the most common rig that you're going to see people fishing with is the nymph fishing setup or wet fly. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. This piece of backing here, let's go ahead and just kind of imagine that as your leader that you're going to be fishing with. So let's just go ahead and say that you're going to be fishing with a strike indicator. This is going to show you when the fish actually has the hook in its mouth and tell you when to strike. That's why it's called strike indicator. So you're going to go ahead and put that up or down your line. These are intended to be sort of like a variable depth, so to speak. So you can actually use these and slide them up and down your line to kind of change your depth as you're fishing. But a general kind of a good rule of thumb as to how deep you need to be fishing your rigs is about 1.5 times the depth of the water. And this is all estimated. This isn't an exact science, but 1.5 times is kind of, the go-to as far as nymph fishing goes. So you'd basically go ahead and attach this on your line, and that's how it would float. The next thing, and I want to kind of pause here and take the time to say, let's say this is the end of your leader, okay? This is where you're going to be tying your tippet to. And your tippet is what you actually attach your flies to. And the reason why I say that is because the knot here that you created, a little bug friend on our table here, the knot that you created is going to act as a stopper for your weight. So again, this all depends on how fast the water is moving, how deep the water is, how quickly you need to get your flies down is going to determine how big of a weight that you need. And this knot that you put here that's going to your flies is going to act as a stopper, because what you're going to find is as you cast, this knot is going to slide up and down, and you don't want them to slide right up in front of your flies. So let's go ahead and say that our knot is right here, and we're going to go ahead and put our weight right here on our line. So that gives us roughly about 2 feet of line to play with. And so let's go ahead and attach some nymphs here. So a lot of states have different rules as to kind of what you can do and what you can't do as far as this goes. Like some states require that you fish with barbless hooks, and some states say that you can't have any more than 2 hooks or 3 hooks on a line. So you need to be familiar with your state's regulations and kind of what that means. Now, me being from Colorado, we're allowed to fish with 3 nymphs on your line. So I'm gonna go over 2 and then kind of go into that 3 nymph rule. So kind of what I like to do as far as what my lead fly is I like a lead fly with a lot of weight to it to kind of help this weight bring everything down. And I like it to be no closer than about 8 to 10 inches from my weight. Now, preferably, it can be a lot longer, again, depending on the water situation, but 8 to 10 inches is kind of a good starting point. If you have a good segment of 8 to 10 inches between all your flies and your weight and everything, you're doing good. So, in most cases, with where you attach your tippet, you're going to actually be looking at maybe even 18 inches that your weight is away from your point fly. So then from there, I go with something a little lighter, just so it can kind of dance around and do what it wants. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to take this tippet, you're going to do just your standard clinch knot to the eye. And then what you're going to do is take another piece of tippet, clinch knot again to the eye, and then put your second fly 6 to 12 inches away from your other fly. Again, this is all, very dependent on kind of what's going on in the water. Now, let's say that you're in a state like Colorado where you can fish. You can fish with 3 flies. I would actually change this up a bit. I would actually have this heavy fly be the middle fly, so it kind of drags through the water, with a lighter fly kind of floating up and doing its own thing. But this kind of acts now as like a swinging anchor between your weight and your 2 unweighted flies. So then I would take, this fly, put it up here, and then if anybody who knows me knows that the CDC emerger is one of my favorite go-to flies. So what this does is it's actually going to swing up from the bottom, acting like an emerging fly, essentially. So that's kind of just a rough overview of just a basic nymph setup, and following those guides, you should be able to fish most waters, at least here within the United States. So that's going to bring me to my next kind of rig here. And this is, I personally really like doing, say, dry dropper rigs, and that's this rig that I'm going to show you here, mainly because it gives the fish an opportunity to take a fly off the surface of the water, which is extremely cool to watch. And what's great about it too is it teaches you exactly when to set the hook as well. So kind of a general rule of thumb when you're doing dry droppers is you don't want a fly that's, as far as your dropper goes, you don't want a fly that's too big, otherwise it's going to pull down the fly. So like this little Adams here would never support a fly this big. So when you're determining kind of what you want to do as far as your dry dropper rig goes, there's some key points that you need to kind of take in consideration first, and that's mainly you're actively fishing both a nymph rig and a dry rig. And some kind of pointers, so to speak, as to how to choose the right dry fly for what you're doing is that if the water is gin clear and it's really calm, go with the smaller fly. The presentation's more subtle and the fish won't get spooked as easily. If you throw down a giant terrestrial on gin clear, smooth water, then you're going to spook that fish and it's not even going to get an opportunity to see what you're dropping behind it. Now, that said, if the water is murky or it's a bit higher, then definitely think about throwing some bigger bugs, because that might be exactly what you need in order to kind of get through the cover of having that murky off-colored water. So anyways, going back to the dry dropper rig here, I kind of got off on a tangent. But basically it's pretty simple. You're going to have on your point fly, it's going to be your dry fly. And this is going to ride on top of the water surface, so you can actually see the fly and you can see the fish take it. So then again, kind of another go-to as far as a solid dry dropper rig. And I do these significantly longer than I do, say, like my nymph rigs. And that's because, the trout might actually be a little apprehensive about what my dry fly choice is. But if I give more time for my dropper to swing behind or even get a little lower in the water column, then that trout might be more willing to take this. So again, if the bugs are popping off and you see a lot of bugs kind of skating on the surface, try and get close to the size of those bugs and put it on there. And then go with an emerger pattern. So what's happening is these little emergers are coming up to the surface and they're busting out of their shell, so to speak. And then they're kind of going into their adult phase and taking off into what we know as the dry fly. So if you're seeing a lot of just kind of noses coming up but not quite breaking the surface, they're eating the emerger, not necessarily the adult. So that's why it's good to have the two while you're fishing. Now, there are some other rigs like the hopper dropper. And again, this is, going back to the big terrestrials that I was telling you about. These are going to be in your like mid to late summer months when you get a bunch of big grasshoppers and beetles and things of that nature. But you can have a big hopper like this support some of your larger flies. So then you can get a little more creative with your rigs and fish some of these bigger nymphs behind these bigger dry flies. And then last but not least is kind of just the dry fly. Just the dry fly. So this is actually just kind of a single fly setup. And again, this is kind of one of my favorite ways to fish. As a matter of fact, before I left Colorado, one of my favorite things to do was take a 3-weight glass rod out to my local trout stream and just throw dry flies, just a single dry fly, and just work on using that fiberglass to kind of skate the fly across the water. So one of the things, I know we talked about how to determine the size of the fly, as well as kind of what watercolors we're looking for to determine again what size and what patterns that we go with. The two patterns that I recommend picking up actually for dry flies, and you seriously cannot go wrong. You can fish these two flies in just about any watershed and get takes, and that's your elk hair caddis and an Adams. And so these two come in a whole bunch of different variations. Like you can get parachute Adams, you can get irresistible Adams. There's again, with how many different ways you can tie your rigs to fish, there's just as many different variants of that particular fly. So definitely not a shortage of choices to be made. But I kind of want to touch base on the clarity of the water as well as the speed of the water again. So if you have fast moving off-colored water, you can kind of get away with shorter leaders and bigger flies. If the water is super calm and super clear, you're going to want the most gentle presentation you can possibly muster. And one of the best ways to do that is having a longer, softer leader. So if you're fishing like a smaller stream, just like a small mountain stream or something, go with like a 5X or a 6X, 9-foot to even 12-foot leader when you're throwing dry flies, because that leader is going to be super soft and it's not going to have a lot of whiplash when you're going to cast. So anyways, those are the 3 major ways that you can get into fly fishing and kind of how to rig those up. So thanks for stopping by, and be sure to check out our channel for more fly fishing 101 tips and tricks. Thank you.